If you listen to certain figures, you might be under the impression that the United States is overrun with refugees and immigrants. A Holiday Inn for hordes of the world's displaced and disaffected. Doors open to any and all.
Thanks to meticulous and thoughtful planning, Operation Change America Forever came off precisely according to plan. It worked flawlessly.
In reality, America's intake of refugees is at a historic low. We had higher rates of refugee acceptance under Presidents Nixon and Reagan than so far under President Biden. Even under President Obama, who publicly styled himself as a supporter of refugee relief, a mere 12,000 were taken in during the Syrian refugee crisis, which displaced around 5 million people across the world. In contrast, countries like Canada, whose population is 11% the US's, took in twice as many, 25,000. And Germany, whose population is a quarter the US's, took in around 300,000. Now, with Afghan refugees, who are largely dissidents, activists, and those who helped US forces, as well as their families, continuing to settle in the US, many are dusting off the old anti-refugee playbook. For starters, let's just be real. Xenophobia and racism are at the heart of much of the freakout. As the 2020 census confirmed for us, the US is on a path to being a white minority country by the early 2030s. And while even the highest numbers of refugees would be a tiny fraction of the overall US population, their acceptance into the umbrella of America is simply too much for those worried about that declining white majority. Ironically, many of the most diehard Republican areas, where polling shows us opposition to refugee settlement is strongest, are ones that are quickly losing population and could benefit from the influx of younger families' energy. But, of course, for many, including many who vote Democratic, by the way, a path to prosperity that runs through a changing definition of America just isn't worth it. Of course, few people come out and say that that is their objection. Most make what are, on their face, more reasoned arguments. Refugees are simply illiberal in their attitudes.
Well, we have no idea who these people are, whether or not they pose a security risk, whether or not they accept our way of life here in terms of constitutional government and the equality of all citizens.
And pose a threat to our way of life.
I fear that we'll see an attack here in the homeland, or a growing plot here in the homeland, because we didn't catch the right folks.
But this also just collapses under basic scrutiny. Not only are refugees vigorously vetted, but the notion that migrants of any status and of any country of origin are more prone to crime is 100% a myth. You don't get an opinion, you don't get a view, it's just plainly, totally untrue. In fact, to borrow a prominent example,
they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
You're more likely to be assaulted, raped, murdered, or sold drugs by a natural-born white American man than a migrant of any kind. Now, if the basic question is, will the average Afghan refugee be an intersectional feminist? The answer is probably not. But neither are most Americans. Yes, Afghan politics and culture, even under its occupied pseudo-democracy, are deeply interwoven with religion, and not all that hospitable for minority viewpoints. But first off, similar things can be said across Christian countries. Angela Merkel's political party is literally called the Christian Democratic Union, and similarly named parties exist across Europe, where countries like the UK and Greece have official Christian religions. That those are not treated as inherent strikes against the ability of German, British, or Greek migrants to assimilate tells us a lot. And secondly, let's just say it. Considering the present state of the Republican Party, whose official platform advocates forcing children to learn the Bible in public schools and taxpayer funding for religious entities, that is presently passing laws putting literal bounties on people's heads, and whose indisputed leader bragged on tape of committing sexual assault and openly advocated Christo-fascism, arguments that Afghan refugees are too insufficiently devoted to a liberal, pluralistic society are pretty clearly not about them being too religious. So, even if there exists valid concerns in these spaces, it's impossible to take the most vocal objectors as serious and principled actors. One key difference between the Syrian refugee crisis and now, and a reason for optimism, is that, at least so far, the actually relevant Republican officials, meaning not TV propagandists or loudmouth backbenchers, but governors, are mostly saying yes to refugees. Only 2 governors so far have promised to reject them, and some Republicans are openly enthusiastic in their acceptance, which is way different from 2014 and 2015, when even some Democrats were caving to nativist fears. But the fact that Republican support has declined so quickly once the far-right propaganda machine began to whir, and the fact that so much of that support in the first place was linked to people seeing it as an extension of the US war effort, which won't be true of the coming climate change refugee crises that experts warn us are coming, are ominous signs for the future of US leadership. But then again, it's Afghanistan after all.